praying mantis is eating a moth. And it is so cryptic, blending into the flower that it's sitting on, that the insects that are coming in to feed and pollinate and obtain pollen and nectar simply do not see it. An incredible example of what is cryptic coloration, and I will end up talking about that as aggressive mimicry. This is another. What in the world do we have there? And I'll transition my talk to a little bit of history, because about 1950, a gentleman, a British doctor named Kettlewell, started to look at the collections of moths in the museums in Great Britain. The Brits have been Lepidoptera collectors for centuries. And what Kettlewell discovered was that in one species of moth, which is Biston bechellaria, if you looked at the collections from 150 years ago, back around 1850 actually, almost all of the moths were very, very light colored. And as he progressively started to look at collections later on, the number of dark forms, which are called carbonaria, increased dramatically, but only in certain areas. And he started to wonder what was going on. And that is a photograph of a typical moth. Let me back up. Well, wait a minute. We went away. Not sure where that went. Right here. Okay. This is, I'm trying to use my laser pointer. This is the typical moth on a light colored background, and the moth just blends into the background. But this is carbonaria on a dark colored background, and it blends into the background. Why the dark color? It was created because of the pollution in England from coal burning, where the trees and the foliage and everything else was simply stained by carbon emissions coming out of the coal-fired power plants. So Kettlewell started to think about that, and what he did was to design an experiment. And here is a light-colored moth. Let me use the laser pointer here on a light-colored background, and the dark moth. Here is a polluted background with the dark moth hiding and the light-colored moth simply standing out, highly visible. What Kettlewell did was to document this photographically by putting known numbers of light-colored and dark-colored moths on unpolluted tree trunks, and the same thing on the polluted tree trunks, and then monitored from what he called a hide, the birds that came in and preyed on the moths. And on the light-colored moth, Kettlewell found that 99% of the dark moths simply disappeared almost overnight. You could see the birds coming in, scanning the tree trunks, and picking off the moth that was obvious. And then the same thing, but in reverse, in the polluted areas of Great Britain. Now, with the whole process, the shift in the color phase on the moths took place in just a few decades. And at this point, with the anti-pollution measures that are going in Great Britain, the dark-colored moths now are being selected against, and they are disappearing and again becoming a very rare commodity in current collections, because the normal lichen-colored tree trunks are reappearing. So that was an early study by Kettlewell, and brings us up now to look at some of the really fun stuff that we're talking about this evening. But I wanted to introduce you to that. It was the first research study that was actually done on the impact of birds on insects as predators and the selection pressure that they had to select certain insects. Okay, anti-predation strategies and other deceptions. Mother Nature is indeed the ultimate trickster. Topics that we're going to be looking at: warning coloration, where the insect is brightly colored and saying, "Here I am, don't eat me," and a related phenomenon called Mullerian mimicry. We then will look at Batesian mimicry, then cryptic coloration, then frightening coloration and associated behavior, and aggressive mimicry. So I'll have to move fairly quickly, but warning coloration involves an insect that is distasteful. And it also, there's a few other species. It includes distasteful birds and some distasteful amphibians that are brightly colored, advertising that they are. But the idea is that a predator that once tries to eat one of these animals will learn very rapidly that it won't, that this is not something that's good to eat. In other words, these brightly colored animals have to educate their predators. There's going to be some loss. There's a few of them that are going to be sampled. It assumes that the predators are able to learn from one bad experience in some cases and will subsequently avoid their lives further contact or the attempt at least to eat these creatures. An example was Lincoln Brower's study in Florida looking at monarch butterflies and the Florida scrub jays. And he took naive scrub jays that had just hatched, were learning what to eat, and fed them adult monarch butterflies. The scrub jays immediately attacked the butterfly, started to eat it, and almost immediately spit it out, began wiping their bills on anything that they could, and frequently simply started to barf and rid themselves of any of what they had eaten. Very effective. What Brower found was that if he showed one of these scrub jays a monarch butterfly, introduced a monarch into its cage later on, that scrub jay for the rest of its life would virtually barf on sight as soon as it got an idea that that monarch was there. Very effective. A single experience could educate this bird for the rest of its life, never to try to eat something that it looked like that before. Well, here's the monarch adult on the left and the monarch caterpillar. The monarch caterpillar, and I won't go through all of the details, but they eat milkweeds that have a cardiac glycoside that is passed from the caterpillar right through the adult. So both the caterpillar, which is brightly colored and warningly colored itself, and the adult are almost totally protected from bird predators once the birds have become educated. This is an example in the overwintering sites where the monarchs are either in California or more commonly in the mountains in Mexico, where the monarchs actually gathered together and the whole group of them, brightly colored, advertises as a mass. Okay, here's a couple insects that you would probably recognize that are probably not good to touch, let alone try to eat. Many of you have had an experience with these. These are warningly colored. These are yellow jackets. They are well protected. These are both females, and they both have relatively powerful stings. This is a cinnabar moth. Some of you here will recognize that. I photographed that right here at Pacific Rim. The adult cinnabar moth was introduced to control tansy ragwort. It's a biological control agent. It only eats tansy ragwort. And this year has been a really good year for cinnabar moths because there's been a huge amount of tansy ragwort and a lot of cinnabar moths have been produced. Like the adult, the caterpillar of the cinnabar moth is also brightly colored. I photographed this one also at Pacific Rim Institute. This is another insect that is advertising. It would get a bird's attention rapidly that something that looks like this is not good to eat, or something that looks like this, or something that looks like this, or how about this? These are all insects that have some type of protection, with the exception of the yellow jacket that I showed you. These are all chemically protected. In other words, they simply don't taste good. This is another, a saddleback caterpillar. The spines on it have a strong toxin in them. This is a lysid beetle that is also brightly colored and also well protected. Now, what is the topic of Mullerian mimicry? It's related to this because in Mullerian mimicry, you have a group of protected species, all of which are protected, that share a similar color pattern. In other words, they're all protected. They are all similar in appearance. The assumption then is that if a predator has a bad experience with one of these species, that it will subsequently avoid anything that looks like that. So the Mullerian mimics then are sharing the education costs of their predators. Instead of one member of each species having to be eaten by every bird, the birds will look at yellow jackets in general or bumblebees in general, and if they get stung once, they're not going to take a chance with another thing that looks similar to that. Some of you have had that experience. And I would judge that if you were stung by a bumblebee, you probably avoid anything that looks like a bumblebee. And the same thing with most of the wasp species that we're familiar with. So it is a fascinating area, and now you can put a name to it. This is called Mullerian mimicry, named after a German named Müller. I don't have the umlaut to put over the U in the name, so you'll have to forgive me if you've had German and you recognize that there's something missing. Okay, let's move on to another example. And this is a topic that is really dear to my heart because I have done research in this area, and I actually published a paper, co-authored a paper that overturned the basic assumptions of how Batesian mimicry works. So it was a seminal keynote paper in the entire literature on Batesian mimicry. So what is Batesian mimicry? This is when an edible species, one that is not protected at all, has a warning appearance that looks like one of the protected species. They are outright lying. So potential predators that see this harmless mimic, if indeed they have been educated by one of the warningly colored models, as we call them, they will avoid the mimic. Now, the key points here, unlike Mullerian mimicry, where all of the members of the Mullerian mimicry complex are protected, in this case, the Batesian mimic is completely edible, completely unprotected, but the model is protected. So here, the education of the model protects the mimic. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. What do we have here? On the left are two yellow jackets. On the right is a syrphid fly that's totally harmless. Now, when I was studying the mimicry, I photographed that syrphid fly in Illinois. That was a few years ago. I was actually in graduate school at that point. So this goes back nearly 50 years when I published that first paper. So this is an example of Batesian mimicry at its best. Now, what can we look at? How much finesse does that mimic have? Well, let me show you a couple things. If I can get my hands to operate, well, that didn't work well. Can you, let's see. I've got my pointer here, right here. These are yellow jackets. And notice the wing on a yellow jacket. It is relatively dark and it is narrow. Over here on the fly, the leading edge of the wing is dark. Looks like that narrow yellow jacket wing, but the trailing edge, which is almost invisible, is the normal fly-colored wing. Notice also that the yellow jackets have a long antenna. Flies do not. I'll have a slide on flies' antennas in a little while, but where the pointer is, those little bumps are the antenna on the fly. On the mimic here, the front legs are darkened, and it literally holds the front legs up in the air and waves them over the head just like they were antenna. And if you touch that insect, that mimic fly, it has the same buzzing frequency as the yellow jacket. So if a bird has grabbed a yellow jacket and has learned and is auditorially has learned to avoid it, as well as getting stung, the fly sounds just like a yellow jacket when you grab it. So an incredible finesse in terms of learning, and I use learning in long terms natural selective process, learning how to avoid predators. Now, this is the paper that I was involved with, Phenological Relationships of some Aculeate Hymenoptera, their dipteran mimics and insectivorous birds. Now that's a highfalutin title. Phenological relationships are the seasonal timing. When the phenology is when a plant blooms in the season or when an insect migrates. The phenology is the study of the seasonal events in the life history of the animal. So we're looking at the timing of the life history events of the wasps and bumblebees versus their dipteran mimics, and how does that relate to insectivorous birds? Fascinating study. The basic assumptions before we begin this study, and you can think through this yourself. If you were a Batesian mimic and there were lots and lots and lots of you around, more Batesian mimics around than there were your models that you're mimicking, what would happen when the birds were out flying around, particularly young birds, and they encountered something that looked like this? If they encountered a Batesian mimic first, what would happen? They'd go ahead and grab it and eat it without having suffered any negative consequence. If they grab the model first and get stung, they learn very, very quickly. So one of the basic assumptions of Batesian mimicry is that the mimic has to be much rarer than the model. So it's much less likely that the mimic is going to be seen by the model than the model encountering its nemesis wasp that it doesn't want to get stung by. So that's one of the major assumptions that Batesian mimicry operated under. Now, the goals of our study and how we did it, we were challenging that, because in our experience in central Illinois, Gil Waldauer, who was one of my faculty members there, he taught the class insect behavior, which I found to be totally fascinating. But the goals of the study was to challenge the foundational assumption, because when we went out at certain times of the year, we found that the mimics far outnumbered the models. And this spring, when I was working for the Xerxes Society in the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas Survey Project, and I first started to go out this spring to catch bumblebees and determine which species were here on Whidbey Island, I found far more bumblebee mimics than I did bumblebees. Now, that completely is counter to what the basic assumptions are for Batesian mimicry to even work. So we designed an experiment to try to look at this and see what was going on. And I'll show you the design of the experiment, then we'll talk about the results and the conclusion. These are the subjects that we studied. On the left-hand side, the 4 on the left are all wasps or bumblebees. In the row to the right, those are all flies, protected. The ones to the left are the mimics, are the models. The ones to the right are the mimics. Okay, this was our assumption. And it's a busy graph, but let me show you what we found. This rising line here was the fledging of the young birds. So in early June, the young birds started to be fledged, but there were not many young birds until you got into July and August. Okay, this first little bump, there's 2 bumps, one here and one here. These were mimics that we found. Okay, and this line, which peaks clear up here, is the population density of the models. So in the spring, if you track this back, the models were very rare, but there were a lot more mimics than there were models. The fledging birds are here, and this is when the birds are learning what to eat. These are the naive birds coming off. And by the time they are into July, the only thing that those naive birds are finding and experiencing are the bumblebees and the wasp models that are going to educate them very, very rapidly. After the young birds have learned what to eat and what not to eat, we had another small peak of mimics in September. So mimics were present in the spring, early spring, and in the fall after the birds had been educated. But keep in mind that these are almost all migratory birds. So the education is not just what they experience when they are on the breeding site, because they're heading south into the tropics where they continue to be educated by wasps and bumblebees the whole time they're there during the winter. So what our results showed was that in the spring, when the models are rare and there's only educated birds around, you've got a window of time when the mimics can fly because the birds that are there already know to avoid eating them. And then another small bump of mimics that comes up in the fall after the young birds have all become educated. So our conclusions then have shifted the understanding of how Batesian mimicry works on a national and international scale, because we now understand that it's much more complicated than it used to be. So if you have any questions about that, feel free at the end to ask. But let's look at the antennal modifications a little bit here, because here is what the typical fly looks like with this small little antenna that's hardly visible. But the mimics, and only in the mimics, no other flies do it, have lengthened their antenna in a variety of ways, or they have darkened their front legs so their front legs are appearing to function as antenna, and they hold them up over their heads and wave them just like a yellow jacket will move its antenna. So fascinating. Okay, here is a soldier fly with its enlarged antenna, an extremely good wasp mimic. 2 different wasps with, again, two different flies with the same characteristics that I mentioned, with the leading edge of the wing darkened and their front legs darkened. A mimicry complex in butterflies. This is a swallowtail. This is an African species of butterfly. On the top is the male, And on the right are the females of that particular species. So this is the male, and here's 3 different color forms of that female. This species of butterfly occurs over a fairly wide area of Africa. And where the males all look like this, but where the females are, and this butterfly is also present, the females look like it. In other areas, as you move south into Central Africa, this is the model present. This species doesn't occur there, and the female mimics this one. And in the southern end of the range, the female mimics this one. All 3 of these are highly protected. All 3 of these are completely edible. So a fascinating mimicry complex. You look at this. This is an acyllid fly that most of you would not want to pick up. It's perfectly harmless, but it really is a pretty good bumblebee mimic. Okay, cryptic coloration and form resemblance. I also found, and you have seen, that a lot of insects just seem to blend into the background. So they are very hard to see. We saw that with Biston betullaria at the beginning when we were looking at the industrial melanism in Great Britain. But the key point here is that the insect looks like an inedible object in the environment. And by inedible object, I'm not meaning that it looks like a wasp or a bumblebee, so it's mimicking that. But it looks like a stick or a leaf or something else that simply does not elicit a feeding response by the predator. It just doesn't look like it's alive. It's seen as an inedible object. Well, what's this look like to you? I can't see everybody, but some of you are probably raising your hands and smiling because that's called a bird dropping caterpillar, because it looks very, very much like a bird dropping. And that doesn't really elicit a feeding response on most avian predators. Well, what about this one? Hard to see, but that's an inchworm larva, family Geometridae, called an earth measurer. Geometridae, earth measurer. That's a caterpillar of a geometrid moth. Here, wow, this is a cicada right here. This is the head. These are the wings coming back here, almost transparent and just blends into the background. A bird would fly right by that and never see it. Well, this is a little more obvious, but this is a small katydid. Now I throw this one in just for the fun of it, because this is the rainbow frog in Borneo that is cryptically colored and just blends into the moss background that it is on. Here's a little grasshopper, a walking stick. Another walking stick. They hold their front legs straight up. Their antenna is straight up, so the whole thing just looks like a twig, not anything that is edible. And birds are extremely sensitive to motion, but unless this would move, they would not see it. What about this? Well, a fascinating leaf here. Here's an area where the epidermis has been eaten off of the leaf. And here is lichen growing on the surface of the leaf. And you look at it, and the leaf turns out to be the wing of a katydid. I photographed this in Costa Rica. Fantastic mimicry. Well, what's it mimicking? It's mimicking a dead leaf. It's an example of protective coloration and form resemblance. Well, another similar. Look at the leaf here and the wing of this katydid. Again, an area where the leaf has rotted away almost, and lichen spots growing on it. But here you can see that it is actually the leaf of a katydid. But again, if it's not moving, the probability is very high that an avian predator would never see that. Disruptive coloration, where instead of, I mean, it's just kind of broken up. Birds have a sight image for their prey. They're looking for something that fits a prey form, color, pattern, etc. In this, the brown on it and the breakup of the wing goes from brown to green, the leg goes from brown to green, back to brown again, more brown down here. It just does not look like a katydid. Incredible diversity in terms of the structural color and the form of the insect. Well, frightening coloration. What happens if it doesn't quite work and the bird actually happens to bump you, or you move at the wrong time and the bird sees you move and the bird realizes maybe this is something good to eat? And what we do find is that in many species of insects, there is a sudden and display of some kind of frightening visual signal that neutralizes the attack of the predator. The appearance of large eyes are a common example. Here is not just large eyes, but what in the world does this look like to you? Does this look like teeth? Is this a head with a pair of eyes and a nose and teeth? Well, you think so, but actually this is the eye back here. This is just a hollow sham up here. And that's what it is. It's a lanternfly from the tropics. But if that lanternfly is bumped, if something pokes it, or if a bird pecks it, it's got a couple really big eyes that it just flashes right in the face of the predator. Small birds are very much afraid of big birds. The eyes of an owl or the eyes of a hawk are enough to cause virtually any bird to go into a total fright response. And that's what happens typically here. If a small bird comes up and pecks one of these and those big eyes are flashed right in its face, the bird, well, you'd have to change its diapers if birds wore diapers. What about this? Again, I showed you this at the beginning, but that's exactly what's happening here. This praying mantid is displaying eye spots and is ready to counterattack. If you stuck your hand up there and went toward the praying mantid, those front legs of it would come down and they would strike your finger. It would counterattack. After the eye spots didn't deflect you, the counterattacking probably would. Well, here's a moth. And you bother this moth a little bit, and there's some big eye spots that come flying out right in front of your face. Well, how about this? This is an owl called an owl butterfly. And its name is because of the appearance of the eye spots. This is a tropical species again. If the butterfly opens its wings, it's a beautiful iridescent, bluish, often color. Not quite like a morpho, but it's quite impressive nevertheless. But these will be just absolutely quiet, showing their eye spots, and bird predators typically will avoid them. How about this? Here's a caterpillar. This caterpillar, if it is bothered, turns into a mock snake, complete with eyes, and it literally will strike you just like a small pit viper would. Just an incredible display to drive off a potential predator. Aggressive mimicry, an interesting case where predators will take on the cryptic coloration and the form of a potential prey so that their predators are not going to see them. The predator, let me rephrase that. The predator takes on the cryptic coloration and form so that its prey does not see it. The predator mimics a flower or waits on the flower for an unsuspecting insect to come and nectar or pollen on the flower. And the predators also, by looking like the flower or the plant, gain benefits for themselves in terms of their own predators. So they're fooling their potential prey and avoiding their own predator. Here again is an example, and you probably can see this fairly clearly, the flower, but here is a pink praying mantid sitting on this flower. The head, an antenna sticking up here, a front leg, second front leg. Here's the hind leg, abdomen. Here's the thorax that all of the legs are coming from. The prothorax here, front legs come off of that. Just an incredible example of aggressive mimicry on the one hand. So that he would just be laying there for the first bumblebee or anything, and they are not bothered by the sting of bumblebees or wasps. They just go ahead and eat them. But a bird would not see that one. So it is hiding from its prey, from its prey, and gaining benefit from its own predators. Here's another example of a small spider that is, what's it looking like? Well, I'm not sure, but this is a bizarre abdominal area for this spider with a couple eye spots back here, and it has front legs that are raptorial, and it will jump out and grab any prey that come in very, very rapidly. We looked at this one already. Here's our praying mantis friend that I opened the slideshow with, that is eating a moth. Again, aggressive mimicry in its finest, just an incredible scene. That's about it. I don't have anything more. And for those of you on the East Coast, it is 10 minutes after 10 at this point for you. I should mention that I did give another presentation for those of you who are ornithologists. It was on birds, and the presentation was on goatsuckers last year, the group of birds that includes the whippoorwills, the nighthawks, etc. Some of you that were not able to see that, if any of you are interested in having a PDF version of the PowerPoint, which will give you the exact slides, but in PDF form, I would be happy to send that to you if you send me an email. But I would be glad to share that with you, including you, Sarah, because I don't think you saw it. So, questions? Yes, Sarah.
That praying mantis that was, you know, that was sort of leaping up or had its
Yes.
What's the location of that?
I don't have a clue. Okay. I found that on another presentation and it was not copyright protected, so I borrowed the photograph.
Amazing photograph.
Yeah, incredible photograph. Yes. Now, I can only see 4 people, so I can't see people waving their arms. So somebody else will.
So if you stop sharing your screen, then you'll be able to see people again.
Okay. And view, gallery view, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I see some people. There's 69 people that are participating, and I see some of you. Hi, Veronica.
Hey, Joe. It's pretty awesome.
Thank you, Veronica.
I
I
do
thi-
I do have a general question if I could ask.
Yes,
So it sounds like if you make a mistake, that's almost the only way you get eaten, but obviously that's not how nature works. So are there any birds that have fascinated you at all that are pretty smart to figure out some of the mimicry that's going on?
I don't know of any birds that have figured out what flies are edible and what flies aren't edible. The mimicry is so good. I've not seen any research that's looked at that. So it may well be that there are some extremely smart birds. The African gray parrot, for example, but hey, they don't eat insects. So we're dealing with insectivorous birds, and the smartest birds would be our corvids and our parrots. And neither one of those, the corvids are primarily not insectivorous, and neither are the parrots.
Joe, Steve Eriks has a question. He wondered if you could comment on the phenological relationships between models, mimics, and the seasonality of plant organs that they mimic.
The plant, the
Organs. Steve, do you want to ask the question?
yeah, clarify what you mean by plant organs they're mimicking.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, Joe. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, for example, some of the slides you showed various orchids with pretty spectacular mimicry going on. But many of those plant organs, such as the flowers, are seasonal.
Okay.
So perhaps, you know, in the tropics, they might be year round, but certainly in temperate areas, they're going to be fairly seasonal. So what does that mean in terms of the life cycles of both the models and the mimics in terms of the period of the year during which they can have that part of their life cycle be active?
I'm assuming with reference to the plant parts that the life cycle of those species that are mimicking the plant parts would pretty much overlap. Just like we find the seasonality of the mimics in the Batesian mimicry is relatively narrow. It covers only a month to a month and a half in the spring and then in September again. So they're cueing in very closely with the time when the educated birds are around, and that gives the adults plenty of time to complete their life cycle. Now, in terms of the small spider that I showed you that was on the plant, I don't know spiders. I don't know the life cycle of them well at all. So I won't speak to that.
So they're basically trading off protection from certain predators for against a longer period of time for that portion of their life cycle.
Precisely. And the species that in the Batesian mimicry, it's an entirely different species complex that is present in the fall than in the spring. It's not the same species. You have spring species and you have fall species, and there's no overlap between the two. It's, in other words, you don't have a biphenological peak for the same species, spring and fall. It's, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Sherry Zors has a question. She'd like to know if there isn't a mimic for the, whoops, just a minute. I lost it. Sherry, could you ask your question? Please unmute yourself, Sherry.
I thought there was a mimic for the coral snake in the US, and I know some birds, snakes, I've certainly seen them carrying them around.
A mimic for
Do you know
what?
if there's a coral snake?
Yes, there's several species of snakes that look like coral snakes.
Okay, thank you.
Joe, this is Jay Adams.
Yeah, Jay.
This is fascinating stuff. the whole story about Bates is how he came to these conclusions is really pretty interesting. But what I wonder is how in heaven's name does this work? I mean, it sounds like in real time these insects and other creatures are aware of their environment. They know everything that's going around, and they notice, oh, wait a minute, that other guy isn't being eaten. So I'm going to look like that other guy, and that will protect me. It's as if I wanted to be as good a birder as you are, and I said, I'm just going to will that to happen. It's not going to work out that way. So it must be, as long as there's been any of these creatures, a long history of natural selection, remarkable number of coincidences, some designed plan. What do you think?
There's been a lot of time, and within insects, if you just look at the syrphid flies, that many of the bumblebee mimics and the excellent examples of the wasp mimics are syrphid flies. Syrphidae is one of the fly families. If within that family, you'll go from things that are just obviously totally not mimetic at all. They just don't look like anything. And then you'll come up to some of the flower flies where there is some resemblance to wasps, but not very sophisticated. And then you move up, and there are varying degrees of sophistication that you'll see within that family of flies, within a wide variety of species. So my assumption, and this has not been tested, there's no research that this is based upon, but my assumption is that the relatively poor mimics, the ones that look a little bit like it, you see them sitting on flowers, they look a little bit like a wasp, maybe they gain 3, 4, 5% benefit. Okay, so it's not all or nothing. How much benefit does a poorer mimic get compared to the benefit of a really sophisticated one? And what is the selective pressure? We see the selective pressure operating very rapidly. Within a few decades of changing the background color of the industrial melanistic moths, the Biston betullaria, carbonaria form versus the normal form. That took place rapidly, geologically speaking, within a matter of just a few decades. And you look at the museums and the collections in the British Museum, and you can see the increasing incidence of carbonaria. So it started early. And in the case of this, I'm assuming that you don't have to be a perfect mimic for the some benefit to be derived.
Yeah. Lincoln was right. You can fool some of the people some of the time.
Yeah, yes.
Thanks.
You bet.
So Steve Eriks has another question for you.
Yes, Steve, you're muted.
Unmuted again. Okay.
Okay.
It just seems to me that the phenomenon of mimicry, that interrelation produces a huge number of potential niches. Do you know of any estimates for its contribution to biodiversity, at least in, say, the tropics? You know if anybody's looked at that?
Yeah, I don't. You look in the tropics at the butterflies, and it's amazing, but I'm not a butterfly specialist, and the tropics are absolutely incredible, and most of the species in the tropics we simply don't know yet. In some of the recent research studies on the tree canopy beetles, 90% of the species of beetles collected in the tree canopies have never been seen by science before.
So do you know if there's any general estimates on the proportion of the proportion of species that are using mimicry in one form or another?
Well, I'd say in our area, if you're looking at flies, for example, less than 1%.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you go outside and you walk through in the spring when you've got flowers all over, even at the optimal time. And you may see 2 or 3 species of flies that are mimicking wasps or bumblebees, but you don't see very many, except for a very narrow window of time, like I said. And when I was going out at Pacific Rim surveying bumblebees, there was about a 2-week period where I'd say 80% of what I was seeing was one species of mimetic fly, and then they were gone.
Okay. Kind of gives me some leads there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see lots of my friends there. Laurel Cook is with us, and she quilted the quilt that Donna has hanging in our living room right now. Thank you, Laurel, one of our dear friends from when I was teaching at Messiah College. I can't see a lot of you because it says there, well, there's only 60, nope, there's 64 participants, and I can only see a small number.
Joe, I'm monitoring the screens and I'm not seeing any more hands up right now.
Okay.
I do have when we go back to Patty, there are a few questions for Patty.
Okay.
There's a new question just showed up in the chat.
Okay.
Oh, here it is. From iPad 5. Here's the question. I have a question about birds and mimicry. I've noticed goldfinches really like gold leaf foliage in my garden. I think they appreciate it, and I can't read, there we go, the cover, and use it to get the bird bath to the bird baths and fountains. Joe, are you finding that with
the goldfinches are seed predators. They feed extensively on seeds. I have not noticed that they are spending time around yellow foliaged plants. They very well might be. I just have not cued in on that and have not noticed it personally. It very well may be that they are getting a small amount of selective advantage by avoiding, and their primary predators would be sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Sarah?
This isn't insects, but as that question made me think about how there are quite a lot of warblers that are yellowish, greenish, various things that, you know, if they come to the bird bath, they look really bright. If they go up into the leaves of the tree, they are very well camouflaged. They sort of disappear into it. But then there are warblers that are blue or something. Do you know anything about what leads to, what advantages there are, or what leads to the different colors?
You have 2 things going on. One is the blending into the background to avoid being seen for predation purposes. And obviously the other is the drive for sex and being seen. And many of the males tend to be brightly colored because they are the sex drive and being seen and courtship overrides everything else. I did want to say one more thing, and this is particularly for Sarah's benefit, which I didn't mention, but there's also a form of auditory warning, and that is in bats, because there is a group of insects, they're moths, they're tiger moths in the family Arctiidae that are night flying, and they have ears so that they can, and you know the story, Sarah, but they are actually sensitive to the bat cries. They can hear the bat cry, and it's at night. They are brightly colored during the daytime to avoid bird predators, but at night, there's no advantage in being brightly colored because bats don't hunt visually. But if an arctiid moth that is protected, brightly colored, nasty tasting, according to birds and bats, if an arctiid moth hears a bat, it rubs one part of the body against another. It's called stridulating. It stridulates and creates a sound, and the bat hears that sound, and as the bat comes up, they will veer away and totally avoid that arctiid moth. Where all other moths, the bat will come up and grab the moth right out of the air. But the bats have learned that anything that sounds like that at night is something to avoid when they're using their sonar in order to track down the flying insects. So one other aspect, which is interesting, avoiding nocturnal bats as well as day-flying birds.
Joe, Barbara has a question for you.
Yes, Barbara.
Hi, Joe. It's really good to have a chance to hear you speak on all of this. Thank you. I'm just trying to be sure I understand that what you have are migrating birds coming through as predators against various insects. And the birds may be learning in a different place against a different insect. And the synchronization of seasons and learning and then the insects acquiring the right disguise is hugely complex. And I'm just trying to understand if I'm getting some of these variables, because the birds are learning in possibly a different location along their migration route.
Well, the assumption is that they are learning as fledglings when they are first being fledged.
Okay.
So the birds that are right here that are breeding in our area are learning what to eat and not to eat as young birds.
Within their local area.
Then they head south, they migrate down, and as they go down, they're still going to be seeing insects, the yellow jacket, protected wasps, bumblebees, the same appearance that they'll see as they head down to the tropics. So if they weren't educated well enough, they'll get zapped when they're on migration or get down to where they're overwintering. Mm-hmm. So I can only speak to the dynamics of what's going on here in the temperate zone in our area. I cannot speak to the dynamics of the mimicry issues that we're dealing with in the tropics, where the birds are not migratory.
Right, okay, thank you.
Hey, Joe, I am not seeing other questions at this point.
There are two more. Do you want me to read? There are two more. Shall I read them, Sharon?
Oh, yes, somehow I seem to be missing those.
From Prescott, she said it would seem insects would be very careful to not move, which would attract a hungry bird's attention. Do they move around at night?
It depends on the species of insect. When we're dealing with something like one of the flies that are mimicking a wasp, then they are advertising that they're a wasp. If you're dealing with one of the insects like the katydids that are mimicking leaves, katydids are almost not exclusively, but they're primarily nocturnal. So yes, that's even true for a lot of the walking sticks. They're mostly active at night. So that's when their bird predators are not active and around.
Think about cockroaches. They're active mostly at night. You don't see them much during the day, but don't want to go in the kitchen at night.
I catch them.
Yes. Hi, Jody.
The next question was from Jan Ledbetter, and she said, "This is so fascinating, Joe. You clearly have both knowledge and passion about the subject. Are you still teaching anything along these lines anywhere?
The answer is no. I've been trying to figure out how I could do an introductory entomology course here. And I'm not sure how to do that. Because in order to work with insects, you almost would have to have microscopes for people to see. I'm still playing around with that idea, and whether or not I could do, for example, a 3-period, maybe 2 or 3 hours at a time, just introduction, going through the new book that came out on the insects of the Pacific Northwest, introducing people to that so that they would learn how to know what the major groups of insects were, and then basically just introduce them to the book and then let them go from there. Something like that could work very easily.
Well, Joe, I think you'll have some takers for that. I see on the comments that say they'll bring their own scope if needed when you start the course.
The next question was, do you think swallows use sound when hunting like bats do? I can answer that. No, the reason bats use sound to hunt is because they can't see the things that are flying at night, and so they've evolved the echolocation. But there is a bird or two that have evolved a form of echolocation, like they use clicks that nest in pitch black places, and so they use their sort of primitive echolocation for navigating in cave type places.
The oil bird is one of the best known of those, and that's in that group of birds that I spoke about, and we talked about that a year ago when I gave the program on the goat suckers for this group.
And then there was one more from Vivian. It's sort of a comment question, but she said that's a lot for the birds to learn. It seems to get worse as they head further south, as the insects are trickier. Is it worse in the tropics?
There's a lot of mimicry going on in terms of the butterflies. Mullerian mimicry is extremely abundant in certain groups of butterflies in the tropics, but I don't know how abundant Batesian mimicry is. Marston Bates, that you mentioned, spent a lot of time in the tropics, and that he coined the term, and the term Batesian mimicry was named after Marston Bates. Great, if you're looking for a good read, just look up Marston Bates, and you'll get some of the best natural history writing that's available today, and it's a couple centuries old.
It seems like it would make sense for a species to invest in Batesian mimicry more in the tropics if they mimic flowers where the flowering season could be longer.
That would make sense. But again, I'm not a tropical biologist, and my experience in the tropics is limited to a few trips, and some of them you went along with me on, Jody.
So Joe, are these kind of like mutualistic relationships then? Like if there's a model and a mimic, obviously there's a benefit being a mimic. So like, do you kind of say that, and Steve was mentioning something about the niches as well, but like that there's like because there's a benefit, it's a type of mutualism?
No, I would say it's not mutualism at all, because the model gains no benefit by having the mimic looking at it like it. As a matter of fact, the model may actually suffer some consequences if you have a naive bird that grabs a mimic someplace by some chance and finds out that it's palatable, and then looks at what is effectively the model and goes ahead and tries to eat it too. So I would say it's not mutualistic at all. It's only beneficial to the mimic. And there is a measurable penalty that the model has by having mimics looking like it.
Any other comments? Questions?
Yeah, Joe, maybe I can throw one.
Robin, go ahead.
Joe, I was wondering how it works, how the physics works when the insects change color to match their surroundings. I mean, given that both are dealing with reflected light, how does this work?
They don't change color in the sense that they are like a chameleon. They have one color, and once they emerge as an adult, that color pattern in an insect does not change at all. It's simply either a structural color or a pigment color that is inherent right in the insect exoskeleton, in their cuticle. So they're not shifting colors.
No, fascinating. Anyway, super talk. Thanks so much.
Is that it, everybody?
Patty, there were a couple questions. Well, first, we should thank Joe.
Well, I was going to get to that.
I'm sorry, then I have questions for you.
Everybody put your picture on so that you can show Joe how much you appreciate it. Get your video on and clap, clap, clap and wave at him and tell him you loved him because he was really great. Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Leanne.
You're amazing, Joe.
Thank you for joining. It was fun.
Bye.
Thanks, Joe.
So the questions that are for me, are they something?
One person wanted to know how they could access our recording of this.
We've had some debate about it. I have recorded it, although I was a little late starting it, Joe. I'm sorry. Sarah reminded me, but I got it recorded, and it will be available tomorrow, and I can send it out to anybody who wants it. And actually, what I was going to do was send it out to the membership if they want it, and also, however you want me to do it. There is a possibility. Jan Ledbetter suggested that we put it on the website and put it in there. So I'm not sure which place we ought to put it, or maybe we ought to put it on both.
If you
I don't know how Joe feels about that.
Yeah, I would. Let's see.
Could Joe please start a list of those of us who would really like to take his course if and when?
Okay, I'll just do that.
Yeah.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
Steve again. So Marion tells me to tell you that you should start a list of those of us who just would really like for you to do a course and let us know when.
Well, we'll have to see how that works.
Steve, I wrote you down along with Rick and Gail Mylander because they put it in the.
Okay.
F-scope will travel.
So Joe, you were responding to where we would put the recording. Do you want it on both the website and it's sent out to the membership?
There's quite a few people here tonight that aren't members.
I know, and we have the list, and we could send it to them.
So if you want to do that, that's perfectly fine. If there were people who wanted to hear it that weren't able to do it tonight, and so didn't register for it, including people that aren't on Whidbey Island, so they're not Whidbey Audubon members. So I would have no objection for you to put it on the website so people could look at it right on the website.
Okay, then I'll do that.
Patty, the other question we had was when you talked about the global big day, you said that there were people who could help with eBird, and several people wanted to know about help with either the global big day or eBird and who they would talk to.
Kathy Bauer.
Okay.
Hi, Kathy. Well, no, come on and speak up, Kathy. I want you to tell them that you're on mute.
Yes.
Yes.
What would you like to know?
Would you be willing to help people with eBird?
Oh, sure. They go ahead and go to the
website and get my email address, and you can just shoot me a question. But there are so many good tutorials on eBird that they answer any question you have. It's very simple, and they speak my language. I don't know, maybe other people have a hard time with it, but I think they cover just about everything you need to know.
Well, I think that may be true, Kathy, but it's nice to have a personal person.
Oh yes, feel free.
Sorry.
Ask me.
Thank you. Sorry to have to hit you with this. Anyway, anything else? Nope.
Yeah, Joe?
Yeah.
I believe you said something about being able to send us a copy of your PowerPoint. Could you give us your email address so we can request that?
You're talking about the PowerPoint on the talk that I gave previously?
The one tonight.
Yeah.
Go on the website and you can get it off of our website.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It won't be until tomorrow because it takes a long time for them to process it and everything, but it will be tomorrow.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I should mention, I just checked, but if you use YouTube, there's a whole lot of tutorials on YouTube in terms of how to use eBird.
Thank you.
That's another source of information.
And it's not a global day per se, it's a global weekend is what it is. It's the first global weekend that they've had. They've had global days, or big bird days. Anyway, they've had the bird days before, but this is a bird weekend. So anyway, participate. We need to do that.
Is there a link to information on the website or in the newsletter or something about that weekend?
Yes, it's in Shorelines.
Okay.
Okay. So it is there. It's just a thing that you can find that links to you up on it. It is very useful to know about it. I'm sorry we're not doing anything as a group this year, but next year.
I'll try and get it posted on the event page of the website too.
Thank you, Priska. Appreciate that. Yeah.
Once my computer is fixed.
Yes, I know there's that problem, isn't there? Okay. Well, it's been a great evening with everybody. I'm so glad to see everyone. I really am. And I think Joe did an absolutely marvelous talk. It was very, very interesting and gets me more interested in it. That's for sure. So we're all giving our thumbs up and clapping again for you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. And I'll see you next. Well, I hope I'll see you on the 22nd for Birds and Beer. But if I don't see you then, I'll see you in November at the meeting. Okay?
And thank you, Patty. Thank you, Patty.
Thank you, Patty.
Thank you. You put up with my mistakes. I appreciate that.
Patty.
Thank you.
Oh, Vivian, did you want to say something?
I just said thank you to Patty because I did a great job with all that fun start and everything.
Well, thank you.
This was kind of our first effort at hosting YouTube or hosting a Zoom meeting. And it was my first Zoom presentation ever. So fear and trepidation, we all moved ahead.
Yay.
I wish we had a recording of the beginning. We could have made a lot of money on YouTube.
I'm sorry, I didn't start the recording soon enough. Sarah needs to remind me next time. I
just talking about when it was all mixed up at the beginning, at the very 6:40.
Yeah, right at the very beginning when we had hosts and different hosts and all. Thank you, everybody. It was fun.
Good night, folks.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.